wherever you go, actually leave some DNA material. Someone left their DNA on this bottle earlier today, and that turns DNA into a unique means of identification, a kind of fingerprint on steroid, and a key tool of law enforcement. So with this kind of technology, we can go on a crime scene, collect a biological sample, and try to identify who committed or contributed to a crime, or just who was present on the crime scene, which is not a crime by itself. So we tend to view DNA as a fingerprint. We often call it a DNA fingerprint, but it is actually quite different from a regular fingerprint. Your fingerprint is unique, my fingerprint is unique, but they don't look like each other. For DNA, my DNA is unique, my son's DNA is unique, my father's DNA is unique, my mother's DNA is unique, but we share 50% roughly of our DNA. So my DNA tells something about me, but it also tells things about my relatives, the close ones, the distant ones, and my entire community. Belgian DNA doesn't look like Spanish DNA, not quite exactly, although there is much more proximity than if we were to compare it with DNA from Southeast Asia, for example. Now, how is this technology used in practice? So I will take a very famous case from 2018, the Golden State Killer, a horrible murderer and rapist who killed over 13 people and raped over 50 women. That rapist was not caught back then in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. In the 1990s, DNA profiling technology, DNA fingerprint technology became available. So that technology doesn't look at the entire genome. That was way too expensive. It's even before the Human Genome Project. It looks at about 1/1,000,000th of your DNA information. But it looks at those parts that are most distinctive, most discriminatory between people. So it creates this kind of fingerprint, although fingerprints of relatives are linked to each other. Now, that technology, at first, you needed to have a suspect, and then you could match the suspect's DNA to a crime scene trace. Then in the 1990s, DNA databases where people who have been sentenced or been arrested for crimes, the legislation in Europe and in the US is not quite the same. In Europe, you normally have to be sentenced to be in a DNA database. In the US, you only have to have been arrested for severe enough crimes, like a felony. But when those DNA databases became available, they were not able, not in the 90s, not in the 2000s, they were not able to identify the murderer and rapist. In 2018, police actually started using a new method, not based on a classical police DNA database, but based on recreational genetic genealogy. You want to find your relatives who live on the other side of the world. Where do you go? You actually get a kit from 23andMe, from Ancestry, and with that, if other people that are related through genetics, through family with you, also take the test, it may be possible to match and actually discover that you might have some distant family, like in the Midwest for the Germans. Lots of people among you have relatives somewhere in the Midwest. And using actually these tools in ways that were not exactly fair, because this technology was actually not allowed on the police database, so they kind of found a way around. They were able to identify Joseph D'Angelo, arrest him, and he has been sentenced to, I think, 18 times a life sentence or something like that. Now, that is obviously an important use of this technology, and I don't want to challenge that. Now, the story is actually more complicated. So for some reason, the police actually lied about how they cracked the case. They didn't use a certain DNA database called GED-Match. They used actually another one, MyHeritage, and it's only when journalists dig through that they realize that for some reason, the police felt that they actually didn't want to tell how they really had done it, because it was not really compatible with the supposed use of the database and things like that. But actually, you can really ask questions about like this technological miracle. So the sketch I showed you was one of the sketches of the Golden State Killer. But there was actually a couple more around. And this is a photo of Joseph D'Angelo back when he was young. And so you can see that there is one sketch that is actually surprisingly close. The police knew that this person was likely to be someone with police training because of the way he was actually handling crime scenes. And actually, Joseph DeAngelo was a police officer. So today, the kind of people who may have access to this kind of databases. So we always imagine horrible people hidden in the dark, but this was actually somebody who was a police officer for many years before he left the force. So because this technology is so powerful, currently, depending on the countries, you might have a couple % of people in DNA databases, or more going towards 10% in some countries, which is already very large given what we can do with all that information. There have been criticism about biases for this technology, so some of my esteemed colleagues have proposed that we just all get into the DNA database. That way there's no biases anymore, and we can actually solve every important crime that occurs directly. We don't have to search for decades for the culprit or use all kind of complicated and expensive techniques. Now, the idea that DNA databases are used only to solve really serious crimes by people of the best faith, that can be challenged. So this story is an actual story from Taiwan. Someone living with roommates in a flat actually had her yogurt stolen from the fridge. And she did actually go to the police, and the police said, well, we cannot take fingerprints on the yogurt bottle because it's all wet and slippery. And then she said, what about the DNA test? And actually, she convinced the police to actually run a DNA test to find the criminal who had stolen the yogurt from the fridge. Now, you know, this is bad to take somebody's yogurt from the fridge without their permission, we'll agree on that. But what kind of society do we build when we start saying, oh, we're going to use DNA databases to solve this kind of crimes? Does it always work as well as advertised? DNA databases and DNA technology is presented like a silver bullet. There is an example from Germany, very famous, called the Phantom of Heilbronn, which is actually a murderer who committed all kinds of crimes across Germany, Austria, France, a female, and the police was trying to track down this female Moriarty, who was actually committing crimes all over the place, and it took a long time before people realized that actually the DNA traces were in fact contamination of the swabs that are used to collect DNA on the crime scene that occurred at the factory where the DNA swabs were prepared. And so they were looking for an East European, maybe Roma woman who was actually roaming around Europe and committing horrible crimes. And that really took a long while before people realized that actually this is not at all what was happening. It can also be abused in different ways. This is one of, for me, the most shocking instances. This is actually a woman who was arrested for participating in a burglary based on the DNA match, but the DNA profile was obtained from her rape kit. So as a rape victim, she had a sample taken to try to identify a rapist, and her DNA, of course, was on the rape kit, and her profile was used actually to match her and actually indict her for a burglary. Don't know if they found the rapist, actually. That was really a big scandal around San Francisco, and she's now suing the authorities. But it shows that when we think, oh yes, we use this technology only to catch the war criminals, we have to be a little careful. So that brings me to the substance of my work, which actually have looked at the deployment of DNA databases across China, in particular in Xinjiang and in Tibet. You certainly have heard about the persecutions of the Uyghur population across Xinjiang, with camps, with forced birth control, with family separation, with forced labor, and also mass surveillance. Cameras, GPS tracking, all modalities of surveillance, and one of the modalities of surveillance is DNA profiling and DNA database. So for the last 7 years, I've collaborated closely with Human Rights Watch, and we actually bring into evidence how DNA profiling technology, DNA database technology was deployed across Xinjiang, to actually be one of the instruments to control that population. Now, the persecution of the Uyghur and other Muslim minority in Xinjiang certainly amounts to crimes against humanity, certain characterize those also as genocide. The situation for many years was absolutely horrible, and the population has been broken. It's a terrifying story. And so, yes, the collection of DNA was organized on a large scale. For example, here a picture from a school. So it started at age 12. Now, one of the things when I started looking into this was actually, how do you get this technology? Who is at the core of this story? And what came out was that back 7 years ago, the key players in that field were Western suppliers, who were supplying that technology to police forces across China in a totally reckless manner. You want more of my stuff? I'll give you more of my stuff. No question asked. And Thermo Fisher is a major biotech company, $30 billion annual turnover, so a difficult player to handle. And so, of course, writing letters like Human Rights Watch did when I pointed at the responsibility of that company, that's not going to make a big difference. And actually, the ambition of that company was very strong. And this is from a 2016 presentation where they advocated for building universal DNA databases all across the world, in every country. And this is a presentation from one of their lobbyists called Gordon Thomas Honeywell, a company that does lobby work for them. And they said, well, maybe it's a bit difficult to have universal DNA databases in democratic countries because actually they have an open and public parliamentary process and they have a culture of being influenced by opposition and protests. I mean, that really is a mindset that is difficult for me to imagine that you would bring that forward as a kind of argument for, yeah, probably it's going to be hard to sell universal DNA databases in some countries. I didn't make that slide. That slide is true, it's real, and it's from that company directly. Now, what happened was that there is a major trade war between the US and China, and human rights are one of the instruments that is leveraged by American authorities against Chinese authorities. And so that story, which I felt like Don Quixote on his horse, fighting windmills. But actually that story was picked up. It was very surprising. And who picked that up was sometimes even more surprising. So this is actually Marco Rubio, conservative, to say the least, on Fox News with Tucker Carlson. So I'm not very proud of that, but actually this is really one of the things that helped move the needle. Because Marco Rubio was actually pointing the finger at Thermo Fisher on Fox News, in 2019, so about 2 years after we started challenging Thermo Fisher actually wrote really quite an astonishing letter where they recognized that they must consider how their products and services are used or might be used by their customers. For me, this is really a major historical achievement. The only other instance of this kind of responsibility that I know of is IG Farben and Zyklon B. I mean, this is really quite something of having a company write even a single sentence like that. I think it's an important historical document. The other thing that I noticed was also this technology is not something completely routine. It's something that requires a lot of science and technology. It's really high tech. And it needs a lot of research. And the research is not something fundamental, removed from applications. It's very close to actually the development of the products and their deployment. So when you bring a new version of the technology on the market, it turns out that you need to calibrate it in particular populations. You do statistics. You hear in CSI, we found a DNA match. The chance of that happening by accident is 1 in a billion. That number, that's actually a statistical result. And that statistical result depends on the population where you're doing the matching. So every time that you have a kit, you want to check, does it work in a given population? Is there something special happening? And so this is a paper involving Thermo Fisher and Chinese police forces, where they validate a new technology, a new version of that technology, the Huaxia kit, in Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hans. And you can really question, should we do this kind of research? Should we publish this kind of research? Maybe we cannot control who does the research. Maybe you can ask, should that research be published in a mainstream Western academic journal? We looked into this specific area of research and we noticed two things. First of all, the most vulnerable groups, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the other Muslim minorities, were, if you bring it back to their population size, disproportionately studied. Basically, the Tibetan are 0.5% of the population in China, but in 1 out of 6 papers, they actually get studied. And the Uyghurs are 1% of the population in China, but in 1 out of 5 papers, they get studied. There seems to be an intense focus on those populations. In my mind, that reflects the fact that when you want to control, when you want to colonize, you need good maps. It's a map-making mindset as part of a form of social control. The other aspect was that in half of those scientific studies, there was a co-author from the police, from the Ministry of Justice, or similar institutions. So the institutions at the core of scientific collaboration, so this depicts the name of the institutions, how much the ball is how much they publish, and the links is how many do they publish together. And you could see that Chinese public security is at the heart of scientific research. You cannot say, this is scientific research, and somewhere down the road, maybe it's going to be abused, but I don't have anything to do with that. Scientific research is immediately tied to the deployment of that technology on the field. So based on those observations, I actually started going to publishers who were most of them very reluctant to do anything about this, but insisting, getting actually other stronger players than just one academic involved. I managed to obtain 30 retractions of genetics papers on DNA profiling technology, 30 papers. That is actually, if you're an academic, you will sense that this is actually something that shakes a field when you're able to obtain this many retractions. So this is one of the papers that I got retracted. It was between a US company called Promega, and it involved the police of Guangzhou in China. And this is actually a picture from one of the co-authors, who's actually an active duty police officer in China. He's a forensic scientist, but active duty forensic scientist. The thing on the left here, that's called the tiger chair. It's a torture instrument. You bind actually your wrist and your ankles, you keep them tight and in a prone position, and after a couple hours, apparently it hurts like hell. I mean, human rights group would design this, point at this as a torture instrument. This is a mock scene, so I don't think there was a real person arrested there, but it shows that it's totally normal in police practices there to have this kind of instruments. When you get brought in front of the court in China, in a penal setting, the chances that you will be convicted is 99.97%. Now, not everything happens on the other side of the world. So this is a database that was hosted until last year at Charité in Berlin. It was the biggest DNA database of male DNA profiles with over 300,000 DNA profiles from all over the world to support the statistics that you need. And we obtained the retraction of that paper that was covering 40,000 DNA profiles. A third of the authors here were from Chinese police or the Ministry of Justice or similar institutions. Okay? And somehow, the German researchers had extremely good ties with them, and they actually were allowed to bring all their data in this German database. We obtained this retraction that was covering 40,000 DNA profiles, and then we said, you have to remove those DNA profiles from the DNA database. And they said, nah, we're not going to do that. I still don't understand what the reasoning was. Of course, I got some paper, but still don't understand how, based on the fact that the publishers accepted that this was unethical research, you can still have it in your database. Now, because I've been protesting so much, the database has been moved out of Charité and now is under the responsibility of the authors only. Now, there are changes. There is progress. That's very important. So, for example, even though the ethical issues are really quite standard, if you're familiar with the concepts of ethics, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, transparency, autonomy, these are some key principles. We didn't need to reinvent anything. Everything was there. But we actually obtained that major publishers, major journals, so Nature Portfolio is really a high-profile publisher with a lot of important journals, they actually refined their guidelines to point at the fact that research on vulnerable groups, like ethnic minorities, but also other groups, is actually something that requires higher ethical standards. And the American Journal of Human Genetics, which is more narrow because it's a single journal, they actually said that you also need to consult the community. This is not a new principle. This is a principle that's well known of sociologists, anthropologists, but doctors, they never considered that because when you do a clinical trial, who's at risk? Well, the participant who gets some stuff, you try some drug, it kills you. That's bad, but you don't worry about, somebody next, your next of kin or as a family relative. But for research on genetics, actually, whether or not you agree to this research is only part of the question because that research affects your relative and it affects your community. In particular, for vulnerable ethnic group, this is a core question. Now, does that translate necessarily always into excellent practices? That can be discussed, but certainly that issues has become more and visible inside the academic community. Now, to come towards the end, we have this DNA database. This is technology that was focused on the police. But actually, DNA sequencing, DNA profiling, that is something that is now entering or has entered since a couple of years, core medical routine care. You have cancer, well, it's probable that your tumor will be sequenced, and your tumor, well, for the most part, it's your genome, plus everything that goes wrong in the tumor, but let's say 90% of it will be the same information as in your healthy cells. So whenever we take a test and we get a sample, we have to worry that in the future, that information could be used for law enforcement purposes, for example. And you could say, well, if it's there, why not use it? Imagine that I'm a horrible criminal, and I certainly do not want to get caught. Will I tolerate that my daughter goes to the hospital because she urgently needs some important treatment? Maybe she has leukemia, and I think, well, actually, if they sequence her genome, they will find me because I share 50% of the genetic information, and it's enough to actually hone down on me, identify me. So we have to be really careful and think through. And for these reasons, I advocate that we make the strictest separation. And maybe in the German audience, it's more natural because that is, unfortunately, part of your history. But we need to make the strictest separation between law enforcement activities and medical activities, because if we do not do that, this is being considered in England, for example. The new legislation around privacy might actually allow police to get access to genomic information, DNA information that is stored at a hospital. If we do that, we're going to have some horrible side effects. We're going to kill the trust that there is between patients and physicians, which is really at the core of medical care. So, to conclude, if we don't want our society to become a surveillance society, there is a lot to do. And I worked on DNA databases. I also worked on ethnic facial recognition. Can you predict somebody's ethnicity from your face? I've seen all the modalities of mass surveillance being deployed. This is not just happening on the other side of the world. This is also happening here. If you don't want to live in a mass surveillance, police, state, society, we have to fight. We have to fight tooth, teeth, and nail to actually keep that at bay. And with that, I'd like to conclude. And I want to thank actually the Einstein Foundation. I was honored to receive a major award from the Einstein Foundation this year, and that's the reason I had the chance to come and visit Berlin. And the last point I want to make is what I learned over the last 7 years is that it's actually a cultural issue. It's about scientists who are beyond naive, people like me, people like I was 7 years ago, who don't realize how our work actually creates power structures in society. This is vocabulary I didn't have 7 years ago. I would not even be able to utter a sentence like that, which sounds trivial for many of you. But actually, we need to change the culture of technical people so that they are able to make choices about what kind of technology they want to deploy for what end. And I'd be happy to take a question if there is still time for that.
Thank you very much. Since you said, well, DNA, it can be tracked, also kinship and stuff, so it's also a global topic. We might have different regulations here in Germany, but what would you say could be a way to challenge these connections globally? Could there be a global institution who should take care of that?
Yeah, so in terms of this kind of DNA surveillance technology, of course, the political landscape is very varied. So I think that it is possible within some sets of countries. It is possible, for example, for Germany to play a leading role in Europe and for Europe to play a leading role compared to the United States, where the standards are different. Try to actually anchor standards that are more common and that are actually more protective of privacy and human rights. Of course, you know, Russia, Iran, China, it's going to be a different story. What I actually did notice, and I was very surprised by that, is a paper about ethical standards in forensic DNA research, this kind of research. It was written by, as the last author, a scientist that was a co-author in one of the publications I got retracted. So even somebody who's hurt, because I know that it hurts people to have their paper retracted, actually they were still able to understand that maybe they had to reflect a little bit about how they were doing their job. So influence is possible, you know, coordination maybe not as much.
We have time for one last question.
Thanks a lot for your talk. May I ask you about the European Health Sector Database? It's not about genetic information as such, but it's a huge database which is built on electronic records, on identifiable information about patients, I would say. And it's all to compete with US platforms. So do you think this is also causing harm in terms of doctor-patient relationships, confidentiality, and possible further negative impact?
So it will depend very much on how it's carried out. I mean, I'm also a scientist. I'm also a consumer of this type of data. And when I put my scientist hat on my head, I say, more. Can I have some more? And so it will really depend on how this is implemented. What I'm seeing now is an incredible level of confusion. The only thing that's clear is that there is a political decision that data will have to be shared. But when you start asking technical details, it's actually confusing for most people, even the experts. And so it's very difficult right now to have a clear picture of what the rules of the game will be. It'll be very difficult to see how institutions will cooperate. When I talk to my clinical colleagues, they say, well, you know, I did all the hardware for this data, and then this pharma company is just go to the minister and tell that I have to give my data that I spent 20 years collecting. So if we don't find a proper balance for that, what I'm expecting is that scientists will sabotage the data. We can actually turn data into crap quite easily, and we'll give you data, but actually make sure that you can't use it. And I'm not saying this is the right thing to do. I'm saying this is what I anticipate to happen. So I think, you know, as a scientist, I like the general idea, but the devil square will be in the details. I mean, the details will be really, really important.
Thank you so much, Yves Moreau.